Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining from. A very warm welcome, and thank you for being part of this glocal 2025 event. My name is Erika Mattellone. I'm a senior evaluation specialist at UNICEF Evaluation Office, and I'm thrilled to be co-presenting today with Alex Clark, who leads the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning portfolio at Social Development Direct. Together with an incredible team of experts, some of whom are with us today in the meeting. We've been working on an evaluation of UNICEF gender policy and gender action plans. And today we are excited to share how we apply the gender equality continuum within this evaluation process. So how we're going to do that? We'll spend the first part of the session walking you through our approach and learnings. Then we'll open up the floor for your questions and reflections. And my colleague, Barsha Pradham, who is an evaluation specialist at UNICEF and is with us here today, will help moderate the Q&A that you can access on the right side of the screen. You can also vote for questions if you like them, so they will also come up in the queue. So we really look forward to a very enriching conversation with you all. Don't hesitate to post your reactions in the course of the presentation and ask as many questions as you would like to ask. Let's begin with a quick overview of gender equality at UNICEF and why it matters so much. Gender equality is at the heart of UNICEF mission, which is about protecting the rights of every child and enhancing their well-being. In UNICEF, gender equality is not only a core principle in everything we do, but also a global priority for the organization. It's embedded across strategies and programs worldwide. To steer these efforts, UNICEF has a dedicated gender policy and accompanying gender action plans. Broadly speaking, the gender policy sets out the commitments to tackling deep-rooted barriers to gender equality, such as harmful social norms and unequal power dynamics that we see. The gender action plans developed for each quadriennial strategic planning cycle translate this commitment into measurable actions for children, both in our programming and in our workplaces here at UNICEF. The current Gender Action Plan, covering the period from 2022 to 2025, for instance, emphasizes that advancing gender equality is everyone's responsibility across every office and every role in the organization, with clear indicators and accountability mechanism to back that up. So as we are now reaching the end of the current Gender Action Plan period and also the midpoint of the UNICEF gender policy, the Evaluation Office launched this evaluation in 2023 to help guide the organization's future strategic direction on gender equality. The evaluation that we conducted covered the period from 2018 to 2023, but we also captured progress made in 2024. And we examine how gender equality is framed in policy, how it's integrated into UNICEF conceptual frameworks for action and institutional systems, and the results achieved on the ground. We took in this evaluation a very holistic approach and look at the organization across all contexts in which we operate, from development to humanitarian and fragile context. And we try to combine in-depth case studies with also a comparative analysis of how gender equality is also integrated in other comparable organizations. In this slide, you can see the key evaluation questions that shape our evaluation. In a nutshell, we focus on three core areas. First, the relevance of UNICEF gender-related frameworks. Second, the effectiveness of our policies, practices, and institutional systems to embed gender equality in everything we do. And third, the results achieved for children and adolescents with a particular focus on adolescent girls. To take us through the evaluation design and methodology in more detail, I'd like now to hand over to my colleague Alex to take us through the evaluation design and the integration of the gender continuum in this exercise. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks so much, Erica. Yes, so what we'll focus on now is just an overview of the evaluation approach and methodology. I'll take you through that broadly and then also talk specifically about how the gender continuum was kind of built in and informed each stage of the evaluation. So we'll start with the approach. So overall, as Erica mentioned, this evaluation looked at both the conceptual framework for the gap and gender policy, how it was implemented institutionally, so gender equality within the institutional organizational culture, and also within programmatic and policy work. The gap, as it's referred to, the Gender Action Plan, I'll refer to it here on out as there's the gap, came with a theory of change, a very kind of a simplified high-level theory of change that determined or demonstrated how we felt that it would achieve its intended outcomes. During the inception phase for the evaluation, we took a theory-based approach overall for the evaluation design, and during the inception phase, we were able to go through a process of kind of collaboratively refining the existing theory of change for the Gender Action Plan with UNICEF to build out quite a detailed theory of change that showed how the gap, kind of what the gap intended to achieve and how it intended to achieve it, really drawing out those two pathways, the institutional change and then the programmatic change. The evaluation then focused on attempting to validate the achievement of the Gender Action Plan against this theory of change and test the assumptions that were embedded along each of those causal pathways. In addition, we applied aspects of the appreciative inquiry approach. This is traditionally an approach for organizational change, which focuses on strengths to catalyze positive change in terms of organizational shifts. It has been adapted and applied within the space of evaluation for a while. And we did apply part of this approach to a subset of the evaluation. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail as we progress through. Finally, the evaluation was a participatory evaluation, both in terms of its setup and establishment, so having an evaluation reference group and a youth advisory group established at the start to feed in kind of throughout the evaluation process, but also drawing on participatory methodologies throughout. Finally, we did bring in, and this is the kind of focus of today's presentation, the GESI, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Continuum, as an analytical framework for the evaluation. It really allowed us to reflect on the progress made on gender, both institutionally and programmatically within UNICEF. And I'll talk you through those now. So at the inception phase, and sorry for that diagram, we changed that to a higher resolution image, but it's not worked out so well. At the inception phase, so at the design point of this evaluation, we proposed the use of a gender equality and social inclusion continuum. This was an adaptation from the MOSA framework, and it really runs, and I'll talk you through the diagram because it's not so clear, from GESI exploitative or discriminatory at the left-hand side through to GESI transformative on the right-hand side. It's a relatively regularly used framework within programming, strategy design, and other facets of our work. But you can, and we did employ that through evaluation as well. So running from kind of left to right, we'll start with sort of the GESI exploitative sort of end or discriminatory end, and this is where you see favoritism by gender identity leading to deepening inequalities. Effectively, this causes harm in terms of if programming design is GESI discriminatory, it can lead to harm for those involved. It shifts along one to GESI unaware. This is where institutions, programs or strategies fail to acknowledge the role of gender inequality or broader exclusion, and it may not necessarily cause direct harm in terms of its design, but it can indirectly support the status quo. So it's not going to change anything. We move across to GESI sensitive. This is where gender Other identity characteristics are considered, and an approach is adopted that addresses the practical and basic needs of women, girls, in all their diversity, and structurally marginalised groups. However, root causes of power imbalances and inequality aren't really tackled at this level. We move up one further to GESI responsive. This is where programming or strategies recognise the different needs of girls, boys, women, men, and gender diverse persons in all their diversity, and address these by institutions, whether the institution, programme, or strategy address these, promoting equal outcomes for all. Finally, we move to GESI transformative, and this is where gender inequalities are redressed, structural barriers are removed, and disadvantaged people are empowered. Really where if you have a GESI transformative intervention, programme, strategy, the root causes of gender inequality are addressed, and women, girls, gender diverse people, and structurally marginalised groups are placed at the heart of the intervention, strategy, or institution. So really shifting along that continuum, and this, as I said, can be applied in terms of understanding programming or strategies, policies, and the like. Partway through the evaluation, there was a decision to shift from the use of a broader GESI continuum to the application of the UNICEF gender continuum. Now, it follows a similar pathway and trend from gender discriminatory through to transformative. However, that focus on broader social inclusion narrows. So this is really focusing in on gender specifically, and doesn't necessarily allow us to explore kind of the broader social inclusion aspects. This decision was made to ensure that we were speaking the same language as an evaluation team, as were UNICEF staff and colleagues across all of the offices in which we were speaking with individuals, both in terms of collaboration with the evaluation teams and gender teams, but also for those that we were going to be interviewing as part of the evaluation itself. It follows a very similar trend throughout, so thinking from gender discriminatory, where programming or policy work causes harm, all the way through to gender transformative, where programming explicitly seeks to address gender inequalities, remove structural barriers, and empower disadvantaged populations. But just a slightly narrower focus on gender. I'll move now to talk a little bit about the methodology for the evaluation, and then we'll go through each of these phases to talk about how the gender continuum specifically was applied and used at each of these stages within the evaluation itself. So largely the methodology took three kind of phases. Overall, it was a mixed methodology approach. So it drew on both primary and secondary data, and also qualitative and quantitative data sources throughout. And we went through three phases, as mentioned. So in phase one, this was an analysis of global evidence. This is a large-scale desk review of existing UNICEF programmatic and institutional documents, ranging from kind of HR policies through to program annual reports, for example. And we also conducted, as part of this, an analysis of secondary quantitative data that was available. And this ranged from programmatic results data to financial data, and also staff feedback survey data as well. This went on to inform phase two, which was our primary data collection phase, and had multiple components, all of which were sort of staggered as we progressed through the evaluation. The first main form of primary data collection was a global staff survey. This was sent out to all staff and was voluntary. In terms of response or participation, really was measuring the implementation of kind of institutional enablers as termed, but really how well kind of the gap was being implemented at an organizational level. So talking about training that was being delivered, policies that exist, how people feel and perceive their opportunities within the workplace. This was the first kind of major piece of primary data collection that was conducted, and the results were able to feed into the design of some of the qualitative data collection tools that were to be used at a later stage. In terms of additional forms of data collection, we had global level interviews, so with HQ, headquarters and regional staff that were purposefully sampled. We conducted 6 kind of country case studies, utilising the appreciative inquiry approach. So really selecting country officers that were deemed to be performing well in terms of their implementation of the gap based on predetermined criteria and secondary data that existed. The idea being we would learn from them what works. And then finally, there's also a comparative analysis with other organisations, which we'll focus slightly less on in today's presentation. And then phase 3, finally, we move into kind of the synthesis and report writing phase. This is where we're having the kind of analysis workshops and bringing together all of the evidence from all of the different sources and going through the process of triangulation and synthesis. It's important to note that at this stage, we used the gender continuum at all 3 phases or stages of this evaluation to inform each of the design at each of those phases, and also really act as a useful analytical framework. So I'll go through that now in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the phase 1, the broad desk review, as I mentioned, this comprised of a document review and analysis of secondary data. That broad document review, I think in the end, reached over 400 documents being reviewed, and that was a combined process of using kind of human brains and artificial intelligence in a way. So there was the use of natural language processing was also employed through this document review. But broadly, this covered, as I mentioned before, institutional documents such as policies and frameworks and action plans, as well as programmatic documentation. And the reason that's really important is it allowed us to then follow those 2 arms and really understand how kind of gender was being embedded across both of those kind of pillars within the organisation. In terms of the application of the gender continuum within this aspect of the evaluation, we were able to build that quite heavily into the coding framework. So both as a kind of with the headings that we saw earlier, but also with that definition and shared definition and criteria to use to classify, we were able to utilize that gender continuum to classify results and policies along the continuum very loosely, but it gives you a general sense of kind of where things may be falling based on some criteria that we developed across each of those goal areas for UNICEF's work. And this worked both for, sorry, Erica, just if you go back to this one. This worked for both the policies and the programming itself. And the second kind of part of this desk review was the analysis of secondary data. And again, we were able to use the kind of the gender continuum as an analytical framework for the analysis of some of that quantitative data as well, to really help us interpret some of the trends that we were seeing, to provide an evidence source around kind of policies and triangulate against and around some of the documentation that we were seeing. Brilliant. Phase 2, so data collection. We're going to focus in a little bit on the case studies specifically here. But in terms of the case studies, I mentioned this, they were conducted in sort of 6 countries and designed to be very participatory. There was a large range of data collection that took place at a case study level, as well as an in-depth document review for each of those case study countries. Again, so for the document review, similarly, we used that approach with the gender continuum again. To support us in kind of classifying or understanding and exploring where some of the programming may be sitting based on the document review and what we could see in terms of program results and design. Then we also conducted a range of primary data collection, and we used the gender continuum to really influence and inform some of those data collection tools, and specifically some of the questions that we will be asking or the exercises that we will be exploring with staff members. So of those, we conducted several key informant interviews with staff members across the UNICEF country office, and this was both from in the operational teams, the institutional teams, the programmatic and program design teams, and M&E. So it's a very broad range of staff, and really was exploring sort of the awareness and the application of the gender action plan within their role. So the relevance of the gap to their role, how they were kind of implementing some of the points within the gender action plan and the actions within them. And looking at, it allowed us to explore how program design and some of the institutional components were considering the gender continuum, how familiar people were with it themselves, then also drawing out more information about those systems so that we could later use the gender continuum to start to explore that more broadly. Secondly, we conducted adolescent focus groups. These were participatory focus groups with adolescents that UNICEF were engaging and working with. Really to design, and we were able to explore the program design and impact and results of the programs. This provided a lot of qualitative data, which we can use to then understand how programs may be aligned along that the gender continuum itself and where the results currently are sitting along that continuum. So we used the continuum to impact and influence some of the questions that we were asking and probing within those adolescent focus groups. Specifically, there was a kind of participatory exercise to explore with adolescents how and if and how they were being engaged in terms of program design, and how some of those and how structural barriers were being addressed, if there were any changes in terms of that relate to gender equality through the programming and the impact. Finally, we conducted sort of staff workshops. These again were participatory. It was purposive sampling, so we ensured we had a range of staff from across different teams and sections within the country offices, and we held 2 in each country, and these were sex disaggregated. And this allowed us to explore both awareness and engagement with the gap for different staff members, and also the criteria or actions that were labelled as institutional enablers. And this could be things such as M&E, HR functions, for example, policies that impact them internally, safeguarding, and several others. We were able to explore how well they were actually being implemented in practice and what the impact was on the staff themselves. Again, this helped us to gather data along that gender continuum. We were able to use that gender continuum to inform some of the questioning within those workshops themselves. Finally, phase 3 in analysis. So this is, I think, where it comes in as sort of quite a key tool for the evaluation, and it was really used as an analytical framework. So whilst we held this lens throughout all of the evaluation, it was very well kind of embedded at this sort of final stage, and it was applied to the analysis of conceptual frameworks, institutional enablers, and programming, so the institutional side as well. It was embedded, as I've mentioned, within coding frameworks for all qualitative primary and secondary data. So similarly to how we did with the document review, we were able to use this in part of the coding framework for all the qualitative data collected within primary data collection, so that we were able to start clustering evidence from kind of the different methods of data collection against that continuum to generate some of the evidence. It informed the analysis framework for quantitative data analysis and informed how we were able to interpret the results from that analysis. And it was used to shape an internal participatory analysis workshop. So we held the kind of a common approach, I think, for us at Social Development Direct is the use of participatory analysis workshops. For this evaluation, we did this at 2 levels. So for each of the country case studies, we produced a full report. We were able to conduct kind of analysis workshops with the team that worked directly within those country case studies. And then there was also an analysis workshop kind of at the very end with all of the team to inform the main report. And this included kind of all of the core team or global team of evaluators, as well as the UNICEF Evaluation Office, and it included contributions from the national researchers for each of those case studies as well. For each of those, we went through a process of triangulating data and the synthesis of findings through kind of structured workshops. And we were able to loosely use or apply sort of a matrix approach. And I say loosely because this is not a perfect science, but when we are gathering some of the information and evidence against that continuum as you progress through, you were able to classify examples of programs against the gender continuum, which you can see in the final report, where we've drawn out examples of transformative programming versus responsive programming across all of the country offices within UNICEF. And we're also able to apply that to some of the institutional kind of enablers or actions, including, say, the programmatic M&E, staff capacity, financial resourcing, for example, or classify by kind of thematic goal area within UNICEF. Now, the way that this sort of took place is you can broadly use a matrix that has a lot more information than the crude example on screen, but having those conversations and dialogues around whether kind of policy aspects are falling in specific areas against those evaluation questions was a useful exercise for the team to go through. And it doesn't apply to every kind of evaluation question or criteria, but those broad kind of participatory dialogue allowed us to map against this continuum some of the key aspects of the gender policy and gender action plan.
Thank you so much, Alex, for such a rich presentation. I'd like now to take you through the main conclusions and learnings of this evaluation. We won't have time to go through the very detailed findings that we have in the evaluation report, which will also post in the chat in case you're interested and you want to read more about the results of this evaluation. But, we felt it will be helpful just to highlight the main overarching conclusions for you to have an idea of how also in the writing of the report we have integrated the use of a gender continuum. And in conclusion, the evaluation highlighted a very important progress made by UNICEF in the course of the years in terms of integrating and embedding gender equality in everything we do, from programs to our way of working within the organization. And although important progress has been made, as in every evaluation, we were also able to identify some gaps for then, the organization to continue to strengthen how gender equality is integrated. So, really, in a nutshell, we saw that, first, the gender policy and the subsequent gender action plans enable UNICEF to formulate a vision and create a momentum on gender equality. The gender policy has, clearly established in the organization a transformative ambition for gender equality across UNICEF to address social norms and power imbalances, and the gender action plans support this vision. But we also found that the gender action plans do not always align and support an equally bold and consistent vision, at least in the way they are implemented. Second, when it comes to systems and integration, gender transformative goals are increasingly part of UNICEF planning frameworks, in particular the global UNICEF strategic plan that provides an overall framework for the organization to guide its work for children and adolescents. We also found that institutional systems like staffing, budgeting, and monitoring vary in how well they support gender responsive and transformative programming. So more can also be done in that sense. Third, on workplace change, UNICEF has made important strides in gender parity over the years and also in improving the workplace for women in the organization. Still, barriers in recruitment and policies aren't always addressed in the same way across the organization in ways that benefit staff in all their diversity. And then when it comes to our work for children, our programs, the approach to gender integration adopted is overall more responsive than transformative, with transformative programming found more in, for example, child protection rather than, other areas of UNICEF work like health and nutrition, education, and so on. So UNICEF programs are increasingly gender responsive and pay attention to the needs of women and girls. However, more can be done to take a more gender equality approach to transformative results, and also to look at how intersectorality can support women and girls in all their diversity. There are also some reflections we wanted to share with you in terms of what we've learned through this evaluation when it comes to using the gender equality continuum. So, Alex, back to you.
Thank you. Brilliant. So it's just some kind of reflections on the use of a gender continuum within the evaluation. We're specifically talking about kind of this example of the UNICEF gaps evaluation. In this context, the benefits of using the gender continuum were that it provided a shared language and definitions and understandings across the evaluation team and UNICEF. So was useful in many ways to be kind of all on the same page in terms of the definitions and scope of what it was focusing on. It acted as a useful framework, as I mentioned, when developing data collection tools and coding frameworks. It was very helpful in shaping the analysis of qualitative and quantitative data across institutional and programmatic pathways. And finally, as you saw from Erica's presentation of the conclusions, it really helped and supported in the communication of some of the conclusions by speaking that same language, and really supported some of the ownership then of the recommendations across UNICEF, as this was kind of a shared process, language and understandings. So I also went through a process of validation, I will say. But those were some of the really kind of benefits, the useful benefits of using the gender continuum. There are, however, also limitations. I alluded to some of these earlier, one of which was that the switch from a broader gender equality and social inclusion framework narrowed the focus to the gender continuum, narrowed the focus quite significantly away from being able to kind of take that real intersectional approach. And we still were able to apply that within the evaluation. However, the gender continuum as an analytical framework is more narrow in its focus and doesn't lend itself so well to kind of intersectional ambition and lens and analysis. And by intersectional analysis, I'm speaking to kind of understanding the intersection of identity characteristics that are broader than gender identity. And then secondly, whilst it did create a shared language using the UNICEF gender continuum, one of the findings from the evaluation was that is not kind of consistently understood across all of the staff within UNICEF. So even though we were using sort of the same tool and definitions, there were still differences in interpretation, understanding and awareness of that gender continuum that did hamper some of the conversations where it maybe was a little jargony. But overall was a really useful analytical tool, and one that, as I mentioned, SD Direct has applied within this evaluation and other evaluations that we've conducted.
And I think that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for listening. Here we have also the QR code that will direct you to the evaluation report and also the methodology that we have used in this exercise. And now we would like to hear from you. So I'm handing over to Barsha to facilitate the Q&A. Barsha, over to you.
Thank you, Erica. We really have some very interesting questions and comments on the chat and also on the Q&A. So let me first go to the comment that we have received on the chat. This is from Elaine from Elevating Voices for Change. And she says that it's great to see UNICEF take this introspective look at its programs to further gender equality. I also love UNICEF's minimum quality standards and indicators for community engagement. It has some great indicators there as well. So our question is, has UNICEF considered combining this together with its gender continuum? Has UNICEF considered applying piloting feminist or community-led monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning approaches to its meal processes? And if there is space within UNICEF to consider having evaluation components that are evaluation with or even by program participants and their communities. Probably, Erica, if you could take this question and respond to this before I move on to the questions on the Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine, for this very thoughtful question. So what we have, well, first of all, try to apply in this evaluation is indeed a feminist evaluation approach. We have emphasized participatory approaches and also a framework that has allowed us to have strong feedback from girls and women supported by UNICEF programs, but also feedback of feminist organization working with UNICEF in the field, and also from women UNICEF staff member working on supporting UNICEF programs. So we have, tried very much, to center the evaluation around gender inequalities in order to support also social justice, and then adapted the use of the gender continuum in this regard. When it comes to UNICEF monitoring approaches, monitoring is led by UNICEF programs on the ground, and we have found different levels of integration of feminist approaches. In some cases, we have seen UNICEF working with a feminist organization on the ground, very much focus on empowering girls and women. In other cases, we have seen more traditional gender responsive approaches to monitoring being utilized. So it's an area where definitely there is room for improvement, especially when it comes to strengthening monitoring and evaluation of UNICEF work, but also strengthening partnerships and therefore our programs. And also when it comes to participation of program participants and their communities, to the extent possible, we have tried to do so in this evaluation in the 6 case studies that have informed the evaluation findings. So when we were on the ground in Peru, Mozambique, DRC, we have worked with communities and also try to involve children and adolescents as part of the evaluation process using various participatory methods that Alex illustrated before. And we hope that this work will continue. There are many also tools and guidance notes that UNICEF has produced on the involvement of children and adolescents in monitoring and evaluation. We can also maybe post some resources in the chat for you to explore. Alex, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yes, I was just going to add, I'm aware of an evaluation SD Direct conducted for UNICEF for Saros, the Eastern Southern Africa region, if I'm not mistaken, in which we worked with a youth advisory panel to collect data themselves. So there was some of that kind of youth-led data collection within that evaluation. So that report speaks to kind of exactly what you're asking about, Elaine, and it may be a useful resource to read into. But that's one kind of evaluation example where UNICEF is exploring that, at least.
Great. I hope that answers most of your questions, Elaine. And on the Q&A, we have another question from Fatima. I think that would be a quick one as to a clarification on what we mean by institutional enablers.
Yeah, so by institutional enablers at UNICEF, we mean all the policies, procedures, systems that are put in place to support, in this case, a gender equality agenda. And then as part of the gender action plans, we have clear also indicators when it comes to institutional enablers that speak to, leadership, human resources for gender equality, financial resources to make our programs more transformative for gender equality results and so on. So basically, it's about the how to achieving better results for gender equality.
Great. So maybe we can move to the next questions from Wayne. So he has two questions. The first one was there an evaluation, observation, or findings on the relationship or link between the extent the country office case studies apply the gender policy versus their level in the gender continuum? And then he also had a second question, if the evaluation has some observations on how the term gender transformative is used in the CPDs, which is country program documents for UNICEF.
Sure, I can answer as well. And we have other evaluation team members on the line, so they may be able to provide more information in the chat function as well. On that first question, I just want to clarify, we did not sort of use the gender continuum to classify kind of country offices as a whole along it. There's too many components, it's too multifaceted, so it would have been perhaps too reductive of us to try and kind of classify full country offices in terms of all of their operations against the gender continuum. What we did note, however, was that where there is kind of more focused effort on the contextualization of the gender action plan and more commitment to the gender action plan within those country offices, tended to see more examples or greater examples of more gender transformative work to some degree. So that to some extent, you could see that across some of the country offices. What was interesting, I think, from the case studies was that they were selected using the appreciative inquiry approach because they were scoring well on some of the indicators that the GAP uses to measure itself in terms of internal monitoring. But actually, we saw several areas for improvement and strengthening even within those country offices that seem to be performing well against the GAP, as it were. So that was quite an interesting one. And the second question, in terms of the use of the term, gender transformative was tricky across several of the countries that the case studies were conducted in. That terminology, I think overall, there were some concerns in different contexts around whether that could be interpreted as meaning kind of members of the LGBTQI community, and lots of concerns around kind of gender transformation, lots of misunderstandings, and it was language that some country offices wouldn't or could not use in their CPDs based on the context in which they are operating. That does kind of present a challenge for the internal workings within UNICEF in terms of how they work and focus in the language that they kind of need to use, and having that sort of shared language becomes tricky and challenging. So there were lots of reflections on that through all of the conversations and consultations and validations, as well as exploration within the report. But it can be a tricky term, and I imagine with all of the contextual changes between this evaluation finalizing and now, that will be more contentious in many settings. But it doesn't mean, it didn't preclude those offices from doing work or implementing programming that was gender transformative. They just didn't talk about it necessarily in that way. So the work could still happen in some of the places.
Great. Thanks for that, Alex. And then maybe we move to the next question on the Q&A, which is from Modi Charles Victor Moini. Who asks any insights about the resources in terms of funding or staffing to support the GAP. I'm aware of several countries that do not have gender specialists and the focal points.
Yeah, I think really worth kind of reading the final report. There is a lot focused particularly around the gender architecture, I think is the terminology used, but really around the staffing and the resourcing and capacities. And I think generally there's a general sense that is well resourced at headquarters level, and then at country office level, as you allude to, that varies quite significantly, and it does, you can see the impact of having kind of dedicated staff versus not, and some suggestions and recommendations around different options for strengthening that capacity and time and resource available within those country offices are explored in the recommendations as well as throughout the findings. But yeah, both in terms of funding and staffing, that was a key factor that sort of came out in most of the case study reports themselves and within the main report.
Wonderful. So maybe we move to the next question from Anna Christina, who asks, curious to know if this evaluation found any backlash to the gender agenda. Years ago, evaluations of gender programs and policies used to have feedback like this is discriminatory to men. The kind of comment one would expect to decrease in frequency over time. Is this the case? And is it too early to assess whether the current backlash environment has had any impact on stakeholders' positioning in relation to gender in UNICEF?
I think I can respond to sort of the first part of that question, and then Erica, I don't know if you have a response for the second. Yes, in short, there was some backlash toward the agenda. We heard that sort of quite frequently, sometimes amongst some staff that are not gender specialists, and also some external stakeholders that we spoke with. Similar comments that this is discriminatory to men, or what about the focus on men and boys is a common comment that we hear. We heard on this evaluation, social development direct specialise in gender work, and we hear that kind of quite frequently still. Also, more broadly and interestingly, what came up a lot within this evaluation is conversations around gender diversity and persons of diverse genders, and not necessarily always feeling sort of that they have equal opportunities, or staff not feeling as well equipped to support children of diverse genders. So that's also sort of coming into the conversation a little bit more, and there's backlash around and sensitivities around whether we can speak of gender in that way as well. So yes, in short, on both those sides, we did see the backlash this time around. Erica, I don't know if you have anything to add on the second part of the question.
Yeah, I think it would be also interesting to add that, one of the, I think, main findings of this evaluation is that when we apply gender equality approach for transformative results in isolation, we can also increase the risk of backlash, especially for adolescent girls. And we saw this in a couple of countries where there were, very good intentions in formulating interventions for achieving transformative results, empowering young girls, but without sufficiently engaging the families and the communities, including, for example, religious leaders, faith-based organization, local elders. We saw a backlash because there wasn't, the enabling environment to ensure that the changes that the interventions wanted to bring were also supported by an enabling family and community environment. So one of the key lessons is really the importance of intersectorality, and for gender equality interventions not to work in isolation in a specific sector, but really looking at the social ecological model, and including as part of the intervention not just for example adolescent girls, but also their families and communities. So really working on social norms and the overall enabling environment. And in terms of also UNICEF positioning, we saw overall, I would say, great commitment on the parts of not just, UNICEF staff, but also partners to move agenda forward when it comes to gender equality. what we saw as a challenge, especially when it comes to key partners and stakeholders, is more the capacity of UNICEF to sustain and finance long-term programs. Most of our interventions, at least the one we saw, are rather the short to medium-term type of interventions, and we are not able to have an impact also on the overall enabling environment when we have limited resources and limited time to also have an impact on social norms.
And I just to add on that and kind of second it, despite there were pockets of backlash, but in most cases, I think there was real appetite across teams in UNICEF that we spoke to and with for a focus on gender kind of transformative work, and some really positive examples for gender transformative programming as well. So I think if reading through the recommendations and management response, it's kind of clear kind of how quickly some of the response to recommendations has taken place, which is positive and interesting, I think, as we progress in this kind of new context, to see how that shifts and changes for everybody involved.
Wonderful. So maybe we have one final question on the Q&A. So this is from Claire, who asks, could you give some examples of the definitions or rubrics you use to describe the various stages of the continuum and help differentiate them? From experience, it can be quite tricky to determine whether different interventions sit on the continuum. How did you get around these challenges?
Yeah, it can indeed. I think in some cases, this is why I was saying kind of it's loosely applied. There's different approaches to this. In terms of this evaluation specifically, we did look at breaking down what kind of each level of the continuum may look like across the 5 goal areas that Erica presented earlier. So, for example, in a WASH program versus a health and nutrition versus an education program, in thinking through some examples and scenarios of what that might look like in conversations. We had quite a range of qualitative data to run through, and really, I think, looking at whether or not there was a specific focus on addressing some of those structural barriers and the root causes of gender inequality versus simply identifying the needs of girls and women at the start within program design and implementation. That was quite a key criteria for us in terms of determining between the responsive and transformative. In other kind of evaluations or other work that we've done as Social Development Direct, we have used kind of a much more stringent approach, which uses a scanning tool, looking across facets of an organization and/or programs in this way, that breaks down components, so finances, program design, etc., with quite clear scoring criteria that you can use. In this instance, because of the breadth of the evaluation, this was more a participatory conversation tool, drawing on the qualitative data that was gathered. So it wasn't by any means a perfect science, but we used a lot of qualitative evidence to kind of pin under each of those criteria on the continuum.
Erica, do you have anything to add to what Alex has responded?
No, I think that was very, very clear, and really, if you have the chance, if you would like to learn more, have a look at the evaluation report that is available on the web. I put the link in the chat for you to explore. You will find also the methodological note of the inception report that details more the elements of the approach we use in the course of this evaluation. And I really hope it can inspire you all in your work. And since we not have more questions, I believe. I would like also to take the opportunity to thank Alex for joining me today in presenting our work on gender equality. And also I would like to thank all the members of the evaluation team I see today in the room. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to my colleague Barsha for facilitating the Q&A. Also, thank you to glocal for giving us this space today to present our work. And thank you all for taking an hour of your time to be with us and engage in this very interesting conversation. Alex, I don't know if you want to add anything before we close.
No, just to reiterate, thank you to the broad evaluation team. It was made up of a wide range of incredible colleagues, which you can see listed in the report. And thank you to yourselves as well.
Thanks a lot, and wish you all a very good day. Bye.